Thank you very much, Dua, and thank you, ASOHR, for inviting me to take part in this very important discussion. So I'll speak about Saudi Arabia and how they've been using lies and deception to gaslight the international community with promises of reforms. So whilst at the same time of these lies, the kingdom's use of the death penalty continues to break international law without regard. And firstly, as just a preliminary point that's important to address, Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. There are no democratically elected officials that can hold the rulers to account. Therefore, when we're talking about the kingdom's use of the death penalty and the constant disregard of international law, that responsibility rests squarely with the king and crown prince. They are responsible. So there have been remarks by supporters of the regime that Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, is pushing for reforms, but there are these hardline judiciary members that are impeding the progress, and they are responsible in some way for the extreme repression in the country. So this is simply false. If Mohammed bin Salman was serious about reforms, there would be real reforms. So in an interview to the Time magazine in 2018, Mohammed bin Salman made a commitment that Saudi Arabia was restricting their use of the death penalty, and in particular for non-lethal offenses. The next year, 2019, Saudi Arabia executed a record high of 187 individuals, including a mass execution of 37 men. And just this year, on the 3rd of March, 2022, Mohammed bin Salman gave an interview to the Atlantic where he said, regarding the death penalty, we're getting rid of it in its entirety. And he goes on to say that the only two places where the death penalty will still be permissible would be in the places where it's stipulated in the Quran. So cases of murder or when, quote, someone threatens the lives of many people. And only 9 days later, Saudi Arabia carried out the largest mass execution in its history, executing 81 men in one day. And so over 50% of those executed were executed for their participation in pro-democracy protests, and over 70% were executed for non-lethal offenses. So when we're looking at the reforms, and then we see what is being said and the reality, it's very clear that these are two completely different things. And it shows that when Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi state repeatedly make these promises of reform and change, they can't be trusted. And the death penalty for child defendants is no different. It follows the same pattern of promise and then deceit and executions. So the juvenile law was announced in 2018, and the Saudi authorities announced that these reforms would abolish the use of the death penalty for child defendants. And Article 16 of the juvenile law, if you were to look at it, it includes a caveat which says that the death penalty may still be used for child defendants for certain categories of offenses. And then in 2020, the royal decree was announced. And it was said that it will expand the scope of the juvenile law. But the full text of the royal decree was never published. The following year, Awad al-Awad, the head of the Saudi Human Rights Commission, addressed the UN Human Rights Council with the clear categorical commitment that Saudi Arabia have abolished the use of the death penalty for child defendants without any caveats. This turned out to be a lie, because of the same year, Mustafa al-Darwish was executed in June of 2021 for protest-related offenses when he was a child. And there are still child defendants at risk of execution now. But due to the lack of transparency in Saudi Arabia, there's no way to truly know how many individuals are at risk of execution, unfortunately. But one of those at risk is Abdullah al-Huwaiti, who was only 14 years old when he was taken from his family home, tortured into confessing to a crime he could not have committed, and he was sentenced to death. And so now moving on, the pattern of broken promises is also evident when examining the death penalty for drug offenses. So in January last year, 2021, the Saudi Human Rights Commission announced in a tweet that the death penalty moratorium was in place for individuals convicted of drug offences. And for a while, there were no executions for drug offences, but there was no attempt by the kingdom to legalize the moratorium in any way. But this all changed a few weeks ago. And since the 10th of November of this year, Saudi Arabia has executed 20 individuals for drug offences. So there was no announcement or justification for the authorities' U-turn. And worryingly, none of the 20 that were executed were known to civil society organizations that monitor the death penalty in Saudi Arabia, which means they were arrested, tried, sentenced, and executed in secrecy. So our client, Hassan Abu Khair, a Jordanian national, has a finalized death sentence and is at risk of imminent execution for alleged drug smuggling. He was tortured for 12 days at the time of his arrest. He never had a lawyer throughout the entirety of his proceedings. And Hussein was recently informed that he'll be moved to a death cell, which means that his execution could happen at any time without warning. So as much as the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, likes to talk about reforms and change, we must focus on the reality. The Saudi PR machine will whitewash their grave abuses with Formula One and golf events, or through the purchase of football clubs like Newcastle United. But we know this whitewashing is to distract from the reality, and the PR machine continues to lie because they simply cannot defend the indefensible. As there are promises that Saudi Arabia is becoming more tolerant, individuals who exercise their freedom of expression, such as Salman al-Auda and Hassan al-Maliki, are at risk of the death penalty. As there are promises that the death penalty for child defendants has been abolished, child defendants such as Abdullah al-Huwaiti are at risk of execution. And finally, despite their promise of death penalty moratorium for drug offences, Hassan Abu Khair could be executed at any time without any warning. So I think that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer.